Thanks for coming tonight. And I'm going to talk about language in context. That's, I think, kind of at the heart of domain-driven design. And I think that when it's time for changes in a thing, sometimes you want to sort of take a few steps back to the fundamentals and then take some steps forward and see where we go. So, what do I mean by language in context? So, I hope you'll get value from this talk. I won't be talking about value objects. Now, there are some words in this. Here are two references to a person. Here's a reference to a thing. Here's another reference to that same thing. This time it's a verb, but it's talking about making that thing, so it's still the same meaning, right? But what about that word? So of the words that appear twice, one of them seems to have two distinct meanings. So if we go and look for a meaning for the word value, there are actually 5 listed in the dictionary that I could find. So probably we're using 2 of those. Well, in the first statement, I hope you'll get value from the talk. I think that's probably this meaning, the usefulness of something, the worth of something. In the second statement, it's more or less this one. A value object is meant to capture some numerical amount, an algebraic term. It's in this general meaning of the word value. So if we have these 2 statements, I could say that in the context of the first statement, we have a clear definition of the word value. In the context of the second statement, we have a clear definition of the word value. But in the slide as a whole, we have multiple definitions, right? So in this context, we have ambiguity. I could try to eliminate that ambiguity. I could go and look for another word to use in that first statement. So I could use one of these words. I could say, I hope you'll find this talk worthwhile. I won't be talking about value objects. Now, all the words that are used twice have the same meaning both times. So, in the context of this slide, all terms have a single definition. And that is what we're looking for within a bounded context. A bounded context could be all the text on a slide, or it could be all the code in the database, and the database is in a subsystem. Or it could be a set of microservices, a set of interface and messages passing between some microservices. Any of these things could be a bounded context. We need some part of a system that we can define, where we can draw a boundary, and in that boundary, the terms, the definitions, the rules, and so on, will be consistent. And when I say consistent, I mean these are things that humans are making. So they aren't going to necessarily be rigorously, mathematically consistent, but consistent enough for us to accomplish the goals. And what kind of boundary is this? Well, it needs to be at a minimum a boundary that is easy for developers to see. So that if I point at an artifact in the system and I say, is this in that context? It should be something that a developer who's familiar with the context should be able to say yes or no without spending hours tracing code paths and so on. And then the people who are responsible for this context, they should agree on the general style, the architectural rules, the meanings of terms. within those human kind of ranges of agreement. These are the things that you need to have a good bounded context. And in the way that I tried to describe it originally, it was basically a place to explore a domain model. And we did that by exploring and refining a language. That was the sort of the DDD way of doing design for business logic. And hopefully within that, we were going to distill some really high value, strategically valuable piece of a business. And this, although we would have multiple models, they would all be isolated from each other, so that we would attack different problems with different models. Because you don't want one tool for all jobs, but they would be isolated from each other in a bounded context, so each one could be coherent. And it's all tidy. And this is, to some extent, the way I described it in my book. But anything that tidy makes me very suspicious. The older I get, it seems like the more suspicious I am of tidy descriptions of complex things. So, actually, the tool of bounded context isn't meant to make everything perfectly tidy. It's really meant to cope with the untidiness of a complex system. And when one of these systems, because by the time I wrote my book, I had worked on a series of complex systems, and I was very frustrated by the chaos of those things, but I had also realized that you can do a lot of good stuff if you can get a bounded context to work in. Bounded within that larger chaotic overall system. So I think that that message got across and didn't get across. It's sort of one of those things where I still feel like there's more to do. Like, a lot of people don't quite get what I mean by bounded context. They say, well, you know, the difference between a bounded context and a subdomain, for example. I can see it in people's eyes. They sort of get what I mean, and then it's like, oh, no, it's not quite it. And this is, after this much time, clearly in part a failure of the concept and the explanation of the concept. But I think it's too fundamentally valuable to not like say, okay then, what can we do to actually accomplish that goal, which was set out, bounded context. For one thing, I think I can explain it better than I could in the past. Maybe still not well enough. One of the things that makes it confusing is that when we are designing new stuff, we tend to align all these different things. When you create a new bounded context, it probably aligns with a certain segment of the organization you're in. And it probably focuses on a certain subdomain, a certain part of that business. And so when you're aligning three things, and most of the examples people put out there have these things nicely aligned because they want to show nice examples, it's hard to pick up the distinction. So here's an example. Some kind of business, a bank, a very simple bank. And they've always had two groups within that bank. They deal with cash accounts like checking accounts where you pay for things out of cash on hand. And they have credit accounts, credit cards. All right. Everything's lined up. What's the difference between the bounded context, which I'll say each of those is a bounded context, and each of those is also a subdomain? Also, each of those is a department within the bank. So if I can explain to you the difference between bounded context and subdomain using that example, well, that's an uphill climb. But this isn't the end of a story, because what always happens next is a reorg. So they've decided to focus on market segments instead of these operational distinctions. Instead of dividing the business into cash and credit, they're going to divide them into business accounts and personal accounts. So, of course, individual people want both cash accounts and credit cards, and so do businesses. All right. Now, when this happens, what has happened to the bounded context that we were talking about earlier? What has happened to the software? The organization has changed, and the way the business people think about the business has changed. But the software has not changed. And the bounded contexts are part of the software, or they are designations within that software. So they haven't changed. So if we look again, we've got our cash accounts, we've got our credit cards. That's the way the software looks. But the teams are different. And so we have a business accounts team that's interested in both of these contexts. And we have a personal accounts team that's interested in both of these contexts. And so stewardship becomes unclear. Before, it was all simple. There was a team, there was a context, there was a subdomain. There was another team, a subdomain and a context. Now it's getting complicated. Everything's all right at first. There are some things that people have wanted to do for a long time, and the business people add a multi-check deposit, so people can deposit a bunch of things at once, and there are a few things that the personal accounts people want to do, a little more cautious holds on deposits, and so on. But what we have is two teams here that have to coordinate their actions very carefully when they're working on these shared bounded contexts. It's like running a three-legged race. In order to win in a three-legged race, you have to coordinate movement while you're moving fast. You know, if you have to hit a balance there. The two kids that are winning this race have a good sort of balance between speed and coordination. Then there are some that are just, you know, they might be really coordinated, but they're just moving so slowly that no one's going to be satisfied with that. Who knows, the fastest runners in the race may be lying on the ground because they didn't coordinate quite well enough. Now, using this metaphor, if we end up with, say, a bounded context that's being modified by two different teams, if that's like the three-legged race, what does a trip and fall look like in this metaphor? Well, back to software. They're adding things, you know, personal accounts team wants to add a few things, modify a few things, let's change some things, let's change some more things. This happens all the time. It happens when stewardship isn't clear, when different goals are applied to the same artifact. This is where the difference between a bounded context and a subdomain and a part of the organization really matters. So people are, you know, you'll see people talking about, oh, we've got to figure out what all our subdomains are and organize all this stuff. Sometimes they don't use the terminology, and I mostly criticize that. It sounds like I'm criticizing, oh, you don't need to think about all these subdomains. No, what I'm really saying is don't get the terminology mixed up. It does matter. Because this is where we end up. In the big ball of mud. This is a wonderful old pattern that you should Google sometime, written well before domain-driven design. But within a big ball of mud, you know, why are they bad things? They still function, you know, the code still runs and it still does all the things it ever did. But what it really comes down to is it's impossible to understand how it works, and therefore it's very risky to change. You change one thing and anything could happen. So we generally try to avoid that. But one of my mantras is that not all of a large system will be well designed. And sometimes these things happen, you know. We can't get too freaked out. Can't try to get back to that tidy world where everything looks nice. But within a generally potentially chaotic environment where not everything is well designed, we can get a lot of benefit from bounded contexts with nice models within them. And if we want that to happen, we need to understand what a bounded context is, and we need to focus on how it can be isolated. And that's where the context boundaries come in. You know, there are places in our lives where, you know, we trample around on dirt, and there are places where we like to be able to walk barefoot on, keep our feet clean. We don't seem to have all that much trouble understanding that these are two different things and acting accordingly. Well, you know, 5-year-olds do, but most software developers can handle that. You know, you want the floor to be cleaner than the street. So, but there has to be a clearly designated boundary, and there usually is. You know when you're in a house, and you know when you're outside a house. Our software needs that kind of clarity around a bounded context. Another thing is sort of modesty in our attempts to create order. We go at these things with such ambition. We say, we're going to change the whole system. And sometimes people literally set out to rebuild the whole system. And I've been involved in a couple of projects like that, and I learned my lesson. But how do you get away from the mess? You know, well, so again, you can try modest kinds of bounded contexts. I wrote a paper several years ago which I talked about how can you get started doing domain-driven design when you're in the middle of a lot of legacy. And the answer is not, let's just build a whole new system and switch over. The answer is more like, let's create a little bubble. And in that bubble of order, we can do something small but important, and with short timelines. We do a few of these small important things, and we start building the seeds of a whole new ecosystem, because those small important things, of course, will be done in a new architecture, a new platform, probably microservices, and so we'll start building a whole new world there. Now, one thing about even the way I just said that is that it's already framed the legacy system as a thing to get away from, a thing that is a problem. Fundamentally, the legacy system is distasteful. And I think that's an unproductive framing. And of course, this is not a very original thought, but it's something which I have to repeat because my own personal biases tend to make me prone to this. And I think most of the people who come to a DDD conference have the same bias that I do. But I was watching a presentation by Rebecca Wurzbach, and she showed this picture of this tree in Japan. This is, of course, a very old tree. And it's all gnarly, and you know, it's propped up. It can't even support its own weight, but it's propped up with these sort of poles and wrappers. And I was thinking, you know, if that were a legacy system, we wouldn't see any beauty in it. And yet we do. If I said, you know what they should do? They should cut that tree down and plant a new pine tree there, which will be perfectly straight and won't require all these poles and stuff. That would be uncivilized to even say, right? No one would say that. But that's the way we talk about our software. If we see a system like that, we don't honor the legacy of that system and all that it's done and all that it continues to do and how interesting it is. So I thought, part of it might be, I'm me in language by now, that I care about ways of talking about things. If I say, well, I have this distaste for legacy systems, but I don't think it's really justified. Maybe part of the problem is I don't have the language to talk about legacy system in a more productive way. And I've been thinking a little bit about that. I mean, a few years ago I was pointing out that I was involved in a community garden, and I realized that a very newly planted garden has an appealing order to it. But it's the mature late summer garden that produces all the good stuff, right? That's where all the productivity is, the abundance, at that mature stage. So this is one of the things that I started thinking about, the difference between, the seeds you plant for the future, important stuff, tends to be very orderly. Although maybe we try to make that too orderly too, but that's a different talk. But this kind of chaotic, mature abundance should be appreciated. So I thought, all right, if we're going to talk about various contexts within the software, let's start thinking about expanding our vocabulary. There's already within domain-driven design the idea that you would map out the contexts and that you would try to describe relationships between these contexts. Some of them are upstream from others, some of them have partnerships between them, and so on. Maybe we could have vocabulary for describing different kinds of contexts, like here is a mature context, and what is its relationship with the core domain? Is it like providing certain services in the core domain? We could try to kind of catalog those things so that we know what makes the internals of this thing important. Also, routine responsibilities that it takes on. That stuff's boring. Do I really want to, that fresh new garden that I'm going to plant? Am I going to do that so that I can replace all the tedious stuff that those legacy systems are doing day in and day out? No, I think I should appreciate that they're doing all that stuff so that I don't have to. And on the other hand, we want to have a sense that, okay, this thing is old. Does it align with the current direction of... So a lot of times, you have a legacy system that actually does a lot of great stuff. But where it intrudes into the core domain, or rather where it's doing core domain work, it doesn't do it the way that the business people want to do it today. That, of course, is a motivation for building something new, for sure. But it could be described. And then one of our goals with legacy systems, if we're not so contemptuous of them, would be, as we evolve the system, don't break them. They're like that gnarly tree in Japan, you got to put up these kind of anti-corruption layers and things that I talk about. Think of them as bidirectional. They're not just there to protect the new thing from the legacy system. They keep the legacy system from getting all messed up with new concepts that don't really fit in. Those new concepts may be very important for working in the core domain in an innovative new business area, but they could screw up some routine stuff that's been working for 20 years and could work for another 10 years. How about naming contexts some of them, we could call them quaint contexts. Instead of that annoying legacy system that's a big ball of mud and destroying my life, it's quaint. It does useful things, but it does it in an old-fashioned way, you know. How charming. Soap. I haven't seen one of those for years. Of course, if it's not aligned with the current domain vision, then we want to make sure that we have another place we can address that. Because it's unlikely, I think, that you can really realign these things. The fundamental character of a system doesn't usually change, even if it's relatively new and malleable. We can still change these quaint contexts within limits, but we need to recognize those limits so we don't break them, for one thing. So, because one thing you can do, if you're not careful, is you can turn a perfectly serviceable quaint context into a genuine big ball of mud, which will be a real headache. All right, another kind of context, but I think different, is sort of patch on patch. You can just see that this has been changed so many times that it just can't be changed anymore. And change, I mean, you know, careless change, not the careful kind of guarding that's obviously, you know, pruning and propping up that's been done with that tree, but the kind of, you know, we've got to get this feature out tomorrow, so let's just stick it in there. And if that happens enough, then you have a system that is very, very tricky to change. And you'd better recognize that. So you stick to pinpoint changes, right? So we could start to describe, well, the thing about this context is that it's very, you know, it's a patch on patch, so we have to make pinpoint changes here. You could imagine a kind of set of almost recipes that you could say, well, you know, you could take a quaint context and you could build a bubble context alongside it to take the core domain aspects, the core domain responsibilities out, where you could start making big changes and avoid damaging that quaint context. Or on the other hand, you could turn a quaint context into a big ball of mud. I'm just playing around here with things that you might be able to start talking about, having a richer language of telling the story of what's happening on the project or the risks of a possible strategy. I think that there are definitely people out there who have really gone into what can we do with these legacy systems? Can we really improve them and break them down? And in one previous Explore DDD, we had Michael Feathers here, who's sort of the totem of that whole area. So I think within that, there'd be certain kinds of things that they could be really, that could be really valuable. Like, could we take a patch on patch and turn it into a quaint context? Could we use these techniques just to kind of get the core domain part out of a quaint context, but leave the rest behind without damaging it? But not try to transform everything. Just get that part out that we are trying to address in our new bubble. I've been thinking about this for a while, so I've come up with lots of things, and I'll just run through some of them. So, I talk about generic subdomains. What about the contexts that are primarily focused on a generic subdomain? Or should we do this more? Because I think, yes, we should. Of course, I say that, because that is to say, you've got to do something that's quite generic, and you don't want to be very creative in this space. So put it in its own context, try to follow standard approaches as much as you can. Characterizing it as generic at the bounded context level lines it up with the subdomain very nicely, and you say, this tells you how we should approach work here. I like the idea of trying to make things a little clearer and easier that way. or to distinguish it slightly from a generic off-the-shelf context. Those generally are kept distinct. That is to say, you get an off-the-shelf system, and that is a distinct bounded context. But labeling it as off-the-shelf, that's part of the nature of the context, and also that it's generic, because you can get off-the-shelf solutions to non-generic things as well, and the implications would be different. What are the consequences of off-the-shelf? Well, one consequence of off-the-shelf is always relinquishing control. But if it's a generic off-the-shelf, you're probably going to want to conform to it whenever you address that subdomain. Of course, it would really help if people who made off-the-shelf systems tried to make them a bit more generic. They tend to expand, and eventually they're always a comprehensive solution. And I actually think that's causes a lot of problems. It's comprehensive solutions do. Here's another one, downstream conformists. That's actually one of the patterns that's already in the book, conformists, but it describes the relationship. It's saying my context relationship to that upstream thing is conformist, and this is kind of emphasizing that the model within, what makes a conformist is that I have chosen to make my model be a lot like that one. Well, I could use that to describe, what part of your model is like that one. It's usually not the whole thing. I mean, usually when you're conforming, it's a certain subset of what you're building that's conforming to that context over there. It's the stuff that's in the same subdomain as the one that they're addressing. And when you're dealing with other things, other issues that they didn't deal with, you have your own stuff. So to really describe as almost meta information about a context, what part of this am I trying to make conformist to them? I think that this would enrich the whole context mapping approach. You could describe contexts in terms of whether they're more generalist or specialist. I think this one could be quite useful. Sometimes, the example I put up here, an e-commerce system with a shopping cart and checkout and a whole bunch of other stuff, it's all very generic. All generalist stuff. You don't need to have some very special new technology for checking out online, on an e-commerce site. On the other hand, if we're talking about some system that's doing machine learning, that's a very narrow specialty. I probably want that context to have as little in it as possible, just that one thing. Whereas in the generalist context that has the shopping cart, I probably don't want to just have a shopping cart context. It's part of the general e-commerce context, and it's one piece of many. So knowing whether it should be specialist or generalist is a guide to our evolving management of that context. Should I add this new thing in there, or should it spin off into another context? I don't want to proliferate context pointlessly if I'm already dealing with a generalist that can handle one more concept. But if I've got a specialist context, I don't want to pollute it. So, generally more lumping with generalists and more splitting with specialists. You know how they always talk about people break down into the lumpers and the splitters, but of course we need to be lumpers and splitters, but we need to be sensitive to why we would lump and why we would split. I think a really nice way of characterizing a context would be the level of rigor that's expected within that context. Because I've worked on some models where things had a nearly mathematical kind of rigor. And we even used mathematical terminology, closure of operations and such. And then there are others where it's like, we're collecting a lot of data that's being turned around and transformed and used for business things that are just by their nature more flexible and ambiguous. And then there are things where this has just gotten out of hand already. It's a sloppy mess, so don't kill yourself trying to do math here, right? And if we kind of labeled our contexts accordingly, part of the responsibility of maintaining these contexts would be to live up to the expectation there, or down to it. And there could be a whole bunch of other ones. Maybe in this context, we expect to be innovative. In this one, somebody in a crazy rush has already kind of headed this toward a big ball of mud. Our goal here is to not push it over the cliff into full big ball of mudness. One term that I'm just dying to use somewhere for real would be to call it a house of cards context. Look, it looks all elegant and everything's nicely organized, but if you make one wrong move, it's all going to come tumbling down. I've just got to use that sometime soon. I could imagine a lot of descriptive ways, and I think we should experiment with this. I mean, we should experiment with all aspects of domain-driven design, but here is where I think it's kind of ripe for a new, it's ripe for a new attack. One final note I'll make, because I think it's one of the motivators for bounded context and the kind of descriptions we might have, is there are a lot of things which we usually associate with teams that I think should probably better be associated with the bounded context that they work in. For example, we expect high test coverage. Usually it's a team that adopts this principle. I think it should be a bounded context where we've adopted this principle. If that bounded context should be transferred to another team, the high test coverage expectations should go with it. If the team is responsible for multiple contexts, but in some of them, the level of rigor doesn't really justify such careful testing, then maybe we relax that rule in this context. We have high test coverage in that one, so it's not a thing that a team identifies with, it's a thing that a context identifies with. And other things, architectural styles would be like that. That's more obvious that you might adopt an architectural style in a particular context. Definitely something like event sourcing or using tactical domain-driven design patterns. Those things should be within a specific context, adopted because they'll be useful there. Okay, I only have a few more minutes, and I can't stop without talking about microservices. That is, the 800-pound gorilla in every room where people are talking about software. And I think that this is a great opportunity, and it's also a big risk. Whenever you get sort of hooked on to one of these juggernauts, like microservices have become, it's always a lot of risk and opportunity. And there's something in me, and probably in a lot of you, that shies away from this because it's gotten so out of control. And we say, I don't want to jump on the bandwagon. But maybe we should get over that. I'm telling myself, get over it. If you saw that thing coming down the street and someone said, jump on, you say, well, it does look fun. It looks really fun. That's an actual bandwagon. That's where that metaphor comes from. Jumping on the bandwagon originally wasn't a bad thing. It was a fun thing. So maybe we should go at microservices slightly differently, but this time, if we really engage, we can say, for example, when people talk about microservices in bounded context, and they say, a microservice is a bounded context. And I say, well, but there are things about it that are kind of like that, autonomous development and no sharing and stuff like that. But the trouble is that it's such an oversimplification. But if we disengage from the microservices conversation, then we're not going to be able to say, hey, that's an oversimplification. But you're onto something, but you're oversimplifying, right? So if you look at microservices, or when I look at it, I sort of see that there are sort of 4 kinds of context there. There's your inside the service, and that's totally like what they say. Everything's, well, it's usually. But then there's the API of the service, the way the service is talked to by other things. And you could say that's a distinct place where you could have context. And then we have clusters of services, because no matter what people say, I see that a lot of these services are designed in little clusters that operate together to accomplish a larger goal than one microservice should do. When things are designed so carefully to work together, I would say that that's one bounded context. You don't get that kind of careful orchestration when things are developed autonomously from each other. And then in the interaction between services. So we publish messages, and somehow lots of other services are able to understand those messages. How is that? If I just made up my own language right now and started saying things in it, how many of you would understand what I was saying? Of course, no one would. That's the point. The way that some people describe microservices is you do your thing, you emit your messages however you want. And then other people sort of take those messages and do other stuff with it. Like messages in a weird language that you just made up. That's not what's really happening. There is a level of coordination, a level of architectural thinkers that are making sure that things work better than that. But people tend to describe these activities and they emphasize the parts that are different from what you're used to. You're used to a high level of coordination, so they don't talk about that so much. They talk about the places where people have more freedom than what you're used to. So maybe we could describe these things better. We could describe the internals, the APIs. We could talk about how these things go together to sometimes be a bounded context. That is, sometimes a microservice is a bounded context, but sometimes be part of a bounded context. And sometimes the space between being a bounded context. And I've talked about this a little bit in another talk, so I won't really spend so much time here. But just to think about that, the inside of a service could be a context. The API of that service could be part of that context or part of another. The space between the services where they exchange messages could be a context. And there's a lot we could do there. So I'm not going to go into that right now, though. To sum up, I think that we have a good opportunity here. In a way, microservices is the battering ram that's breaking down all the conventions and making all kinds of new thinking possible. No matter how much collateral damage might go with that, it is definitely an opportunity, and it would be foolish to ignore it. But on the other hand, we need to really think and not just join the crowd. So, I think characterizing bounded context in the ways that I talked about it, thinking about legacy as an asset, and maybe an asset that could be described. And not all legacy systems are such assets, right? If we start really getting good at describing them, we can talk about why we want to get rid of these things that we want to, or why we want to let them live forever. Microservices as context, but not in such a simplistic way. And taking that concept of context mapping that I talked about 15 years ago and really maybe shaking it up and saying, well, now we have a richer way of doing it. And who knows, maybe there'll even be some software tools that can help with that, make it more tangible. I do feel like part of the problem is that it is so abstract. But I've always resisted the tools because I think most tools dumb a thing down. But maybe tools. Now, what it takes to accomplish this is not a person thinking about it, but a bunch of people thinking about it. Specifically, a community of practitioners, but not a kind of unified, groupthink community of practitioners. An intellectually honest community of practitioners that has something in common, though. The DDD principles can be a really nice way to say we do stand for something, but we have a lot of room within it, because DDD, as I've said before, is not a religion. If we're going to call it something, it's almost like an applied philosophy, but it's definitely not a religion. That means we don't have to agree about everything. And we should be skeptical, especially when the results aren't what we expect. When 15 years later, bounded context is still misunderstood, then I say, time to think about, well, what are we going to do about that? There's something off. And many other things, And then when the world changes, it presents new opportunities. Microservices is here. It used to be nearly impossible to persuade people to have a separate database for one little part of the system. And I used to beg for those things. And suddenly, it's fine. Okay, we'll have a separate system. Wow, right? And I mean, it just happened overnight, at least in my experience. And so, it's a moment. I think this is a moment. And it's the kind of community that could take advantage of it. So, here we are in this conference where we get a chance to talk to each other, and all these great speakers who are going to, share their thoughts. And let's talk to each other and try to innovate in this space. I think one of my responsibilities, because of the privileged position I'm in this community, is to say that it's okay to disagree with me or with any of these other people, but especially with me, about how DDD should be done. I would like us to converge on some definitions of terms so that when we disagree, we're actually disagreeing about something coherent that we can actually discuss, and not just saying the same thing with different words. That's sort of dumb disagreement. But I don't want to be a cult leader, right? That repels me. And I want to say that out loud because I think, people are very deferential. I appreciate the honors that are given to me, but I don't want to give the impression that we need a real debate. We need people coming up with new ideas for how to do it. I think I've got a better way to map contexts. Well, I'd like to hear it. Or even, this thing just doesn't work. We've tried it. It just didn't work. I mean, it would be nice if it was something specific we could really think about, not just, this is a bunch of crap. Well, that's not too useful. But real thoughtful discussion of that a certain tool just doesn't work. And finally, as much for my sake as yours, we need a community that will bring vigor to the topic, vigor and fun, so that this is not just a 15-year-old thing that we're all studying like an ancient scroll, but a real living body of thought. That will be enough to keep me interested enough to come back to the conference again in the future. Because I could get bored. I could just get bored with this whole thing. If it doesn't change, I'll go off and, whatever comes after microservices, I'm going for it. So make this interesting, right? Make it fun and vigorous, if you know what I mean. So that's what I had to say tonight. I'm looking forward to the next 2 days. Going to go to a lot of sessions and talk to people between sessions, and going to be good. So I hope to talk to many of you in the next 2 days. Thanks.